The box arrived without ceremony. There was no palace announcement, no photographer waiting outside, no official crest embossed across the lid. It was simply placed into Sophie's hands on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, wrapped in faded cream paper and tied with a narrow blue ribbon that had lost most of its color with age. For several seconds, Sophie did not open it. She looked at the handwriting on the accompanying card instead. Only 6 words had been written. For Sophie, when the time is right. There was no signature. That was the first thing that unsettled her. The second was the name of the person who had quietly arranged for the package to reach her. The details in this dramatized account had been kept deliberately vague. The object had supposedly remained in private hands for years, passed through a chain of custodians who believed it was connected to Princess Diana. And yet Sophie had never heard of it. When she finally lifted the lid, she found something that appeared almost disappointingly ordinary. A small silver photograph frame. It was old, tarnished around the edges. The hinge was slightly loose, and a fine scratch crossed the lower corner. There was no jewel, no royal insignia, no priceless stone, nothing that immediately explained why anyone would have considered it important enough to conceal. But inside the frame was a photograph, and the photograph changed everything. Sophie stared at it for several seconds before she recognized the setting. It was not a formal royal occasion. It was not a palace portrait. It was a quiet photograph, apparently taken during an ordinary moment. Diana was standing near a window. She was smiling, and beside her was an object Sophie recognized immediately, the same silver frame. Sophie turned the photograph over. There, written in faded blue ink, was a sentence. Not a date, not a name, a sentence. Some things are meant to find their way home. Sophie read it twice. Then a third time. And somewhere else in Britain, according to the fictional story that follows, Camilla was about to hear that Sophie had received something connected to Diana. Her reaction would not be anger. It would not be jealousy. It would not even be fear in the conventional sense. It would be something much harder to explain. Because Camilla, in this imagined story, knew something about that little silver frame that Sophie did not. And when she heard its name, she reportedly asked only one question. Where did it come from? Before we continue, if you enjoy royal mysteries, historical stories, and fictionalized commentary inspired by the British royal family, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, or somewhere much farther away. Because this story begins with a small box. But what Sophie eventually discovered inside it would force several members of the royal family to look at Diana's legacy in an entirely different way. The object itself was almost absurdly modest. That was what made it so difficult to understand. For centuries, royal families had accumulated objects that announced their importance. Crowns, medals, jewelry, portraits, ceremonial swords, historic documents, pieces of furniture that had belonged to monarchs, objects surrounded by provenance, objects that could be displayed behind glass and explained to visitors. The silver frame was none of those things. It looked like something that could have been purchased from a small antique shop. Yet the person who delivered it to Sophie had apparently treated it as though it carried a responsibility. Not a financial responsibility, a personal one. That distinction would become increasingly important. The story, as dramatized here, begins several weeks before Sophie received the package. A private collection was being reviewed following the death of an elderly woman who had spent much of her life preserving family papers, photographs, and personal effects. Among those possessions was a small locked case. The woman had reportedly told her family only that certain items inside were not to be sold. They were to be returned. Nobody understood what she meant. There was no clear explanation. No legal document publicly establishing ownership. No official royal correspondence. Just a collection of personal material that had apparently traveled through several hands. Inside the case were photographs, a handwritten diary, several envelopes, and the silver frame. One photograph attracted particular attention. It showed Diana. The exact circumstances of the photograph were unclear within the fictional narrative. There was no claim that it had been an official palace photograph. Instead, it appeared to belong to a much more private moment. The frame itself was visible on a nearby table. That detail might have been ignored entirely if not for the writing on the back. Some things are meant to find their way home. The person examining the collection began searching through the accompanying papers, and eventually found a reference to Sophie, not to the Princess of Wales, not to William, not to Catherine, Sophie, That was the moment the little frame became something else. A question. Why Sophie? There were obvious reasons to wonder. Sophie had become one of the more visible working members of the royal family over the years, particularly through her charitable work and public duties. But none of those things explained a private connection to an object associated with Diana. There was no obvious family relationship, no publicly known inheritance, no established historical link, and that made the discovery more intriguing. If the object truly had a connection to Diana, why would it have been intended for Sophie? The fictional explanation would not emerge immediately. Instead, Sophie received the frame with almost no context. She was told that the people involved believed it belonged with her. That was all. Imagine being handed an object and told that someone, somewhere, had decided you were its rightful custodian, not because of its value, because of its meaning. Sophie reportedly asked what the frame contained. The answer was simple. Something Diana once kept. That sentence stayed with her. She looked again at the photograph. Diana was smiling beside a window. The frame was visible behind her. At first, Sophie wondered whether the photograph itself might be the important part. Perhaps there was a person in the background. Perhaps the room contained a clue. Perhaps the photograph had been taken at a significant moment. But the more she studied it, the stranger it became. Diana appeared relaxed. There was no ceremony, no obvious significance. Nothing in the image suggested history was being made. And perhaps that was precisely why it mattered. Diana's public life had been documented endlessly. Her clothes had been photographed, her engagements had been recorded, her charitable work had been chronicled. Her marriage, separation, and eventual divorce had been analyzed by generations of commentators. But private life was different. Private life existed in small things: letters, photographs, objects, handwritten notes, a favorite book, a piece of jewelry worn without explanation, a photograph kept in a drawer. The silver frame belonged to that world, and Sophie began to wonder whether that was why it had remained hidden. Not because somebody wanted to conceal a scandal, but because somebody had wanted to protect a memory. That possibility changed the tone of her investigation. She did not immediately involve the wider family. Instead, she began quietly examining the material that had arrived with the frame. There were 3 envelopes. The first contained photographs. The second contained handwritten pages. The third was empty. At least, it appeared empty. Sophie noticed that the paper had been folded several times. She opened it carefully. Inside the fold was a faint impression. Someone had once written on a sheet that had been placed above it. The words were incomplete. Only fragments remained. When the children are older, not for display. Someone kind enough to understand. Sophie stopped. The phrase about the children caught her attention. Diana had 2 sons, William and Harry. So why had the object not gone directly to one of them? That became the central question. Perhaps the answer was simple. Perhaps the frame had simply passed through another family. Perhaps Sophie had received it because she was considered trustworthy. Or perhaps there was another reason. The fictional narrative now moves backward. To understand why the frame could have mattered to Diana, we have to remember something about the Princess of Wales that is publicly established. Diana was deeply interested in people, not simply famous people, ordinary people, children, patients, families dealing with hardship, people who had been pushed to the margins. Her public work increasingly reflected that interest. She had an unusual ability to make a person feel noticed. That quality became part of her public identity. But there was another side to it. Diana also understood the power of personal objects. Her life had been lived under extraordinary scrutiny. The smallest item could become symbolic. A dress could become an icon. A photograph could become a historical document. A letter could be dissected decades later. That meant private objects had to carry a different kind of weight. They were not merely possessions. They could become evidence of a person. And in this fictional story, the silver frame represented something Diana had deliberately kept away from public attention. The frame was supposedly connected to a period when Diana was trying to establish a life beyond the image people had constructed around her. She wanted her sons to know her as a mother, not merely as the Princess of Wales, not as the woman in newspapers, not as the woman surrounded by cameras. A mother. That distinction would become central to the mystery. According to the dramatized narrative, Diana had once kept a small collection of ordinary objects in a private drawer. None had obvious monetary value. A handwritten recipe, a pressed flower, a child's drawing, a photograph, and the silver frame. The objects represented moments that had nothing to do with royal protocol. They were memories of ordinary life. the kind of things that disappear easily when families move from one home to another. But Diana, according to this fictional account, had a particular reason for preserving them. She wanted her children to understand that family history was not only about titles, it was also about people. That idea may sound simple, but within the story, it becomes the key to everything. The silver frame had apparently held a photograph that Diana considered deeply personal. Not necessarily a secret photograph, not something scandalous, something emotionally significant. And at some point, the photograph was removed. Why? Nobody knew. The frame traveled separately. The photograph went somewhere else. The two pieces were eventually reunited decades later. That alone would have been interesting. But the papers suggested something more. A person close to Diana had apparently been asked to keep the frame safe until a future moment. The instruction was not described as an official royal arrangement. It was personal, informal, almost fragile. And because it was never turned into an official record, it was vulnerable to being forgotten. That is exactly what happened. Years passed. People changed. Families moved. Boxes were stored. Memories became uncertain. The frame disappeared into private custody, until it surfaced again. And then it reached Sophie. But Sophie still did not know what Diana had wanted. She only knew that the phrase on the photograph kept bothering her. Some things are meant to find their way home. Home. What did Diana mean by home? The royal family? Her sons? Her childhood? Or something entirely different? Sophie returned to the handwritten pages. The handwriting was inconsistent. Some pages appeared to have been written by the same person. Others were copies. One passage seemed particularly important. It referred to a person who was quietly reliable. Sophie initially assumed it described a member of Diana's staff, but then she noticed another word. Wife. The person had apparently been trusted because of her ability to remain outside the center of public drama. Someone who could hold something without turning it into a story. Someone who would not seek attention. Someone who would understand that a memory did not need an audience. Sophie sat with that idea, and then she realized why her name might have appeared. She had never been the loudest royal. She had never been the most photographed. She had often worked quietly. That did not prove anything. But within the fictional story, it provided a plausible reason why someone might have selected her. The heirloom did not need a blood connection. It needed a temperament. That was the first major clue. The second came from a photograph. Among the papers was an old image of several women at a gathering. Diana was visible. So was another woman. Sophie did not recognize her. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note. She listened when others spoke. That sentence was followed by a name. The name had been partly erased. Sophie could make out only the first letter. C. She stared at it. Then she turned the photograph over again. Could it mean anything? There were many people whose names began with C. There was no reason to jump to a conclusion. But the story had now acquired another layer. Camilla. The name that Sophie had been trying not to think about. Because if Camilla was somehow connected to the frame, the mystery was no longer simply about Diana. It was about the complicated history that existed between the people surrounding her memory. That was when Sophie finally decided she could not investigate the object entirely alone. She contacted Anne. Not because Anne was the easiest person to approach. Quite the opposite. Anne had a reputation, both publicly and privately, for being practical. She was not someone likely to be swept away by romantic theories. If the frame was meaningless, Anne would probably say so. If it had genuine historical significance, Anne would want evidence. Sophie showed her the photograph. Anne studied it quietly. She did not react dramatically. She asked where it had come from. Sophie explained. Then Anne asked to see the writing. She read the phrase, "Some things are meant to find their way home." Anne looked at Sophie. "What does home mean here?" Sophie admitted that she did not know. Anne looked again at the frame. Then she noticed something Sophie had missed. A tiny mark beneath the hinge. 3 letters. Not a name, a date code. At least, that was what it appeared to be. Anne's expression changed slightly. She had seen similar markings on old objects before. Not necessarily royal. Not necessarily valuable, but useful for tracing where something had been manufactured or repaired. The frame had been altered. Someone had replaced part of the hinge. And underneath the replacement was another inscription. A single word. Remember. Now the story had 2 messages. Home. Remember. Anne did not pretend to know what they meant, but she did something more important. She suggested that Sophie find out who had repaired the frame. If the repair could be dated, perhaps the history of the object could be reconstructed. And that investigation eventually led to a small workshop. The details are fictional. The workshop itself is part of the dramatization, but within the story its records were incomplete. There was, however, one entry: a silver frame, private repair. Customer requested no replacement of inscription. The date placed the repair years after Diana's death. That meant someone had deliberately preserved the frame long after Diana was gone. Why? The answer remained hidden, until Sophie discovered the photograph had a false backing. Behind the visible photograph was another piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was a list. 5 names: William, Harry, Charles, Camilla, and Sophie. Sophie read the names twice. Then she noticed the order. They were not arranged alphabetically. They were not arranged by age. The first 2 were Diana's sons. The next 2 were Charles and Camilla. And the final name was hers. Why? That was the question that finally reached Camilla. The news, in this fictional account, was not delivered dramatically. There was no confrontation, no accusation. Sophie simply made it known that she had found something connected to Diana and wanted to understand its history before deciding what should happen to it. Camilla was informed, and when she heard the words silver frame, she reportedly became very quiet. This is where the dramatization deliberately departs from established history. There is no verified public record confirming that Camilla has ever reacted to such an object. The emotional response described here is entirely fictional. But within the story, Camilla did not ask whether it was valuable. She asked whether Sophie had seen the back. When Sophie said yes, Camilla asked what was written there. Sophie hesitated. Then she told her, "Home. Remember." Camilla closed her eyes. For a moment, she said nothing. And that silence became more meaningful than any dramatic outburst could have been. Because the fictional Camilla knew the phrase. Not because she had seen the frame before, but because she had heard something similar years earlier. A conversation. A memory. A moment that had never become part of the public record. A moment involving Diana and Charles. Camilla had spent years living with the knowledge that Diana's memory could never be separated entirely from the history of her own relationship with Charles. The story does not portray her as a villain. It would be too easy, too shallow. Instead, it portrays her as a woman who understands that some wounds do not disappear simply because time passes. People can build new lives. They can make peace with the past. They can perform their duties. But certain memories remain complicated. And in this imagined story, the silver frame had suddenly brought one of those memories back. Camilla asked Sophie to let her see it. Sophie agreed. Camilla held the frame carefully. She turned it over, saw the inscription, and then noticed the tiny mark near the hinge. Her face changed. Anne immediately noticed. "You know it," Anne said. Camilla did not answer immediately. Eventually, she explained that years earlier, Diana had once spoken about a small silver frame. Not this exact frame. At least, Camilla could not be certain. But the description matched. Diana had supposedly mentioned an object she wanted to keep for her children. Something ordinary. Something that would remind them that life was bigger than royal titles. Camilla remembered the idea. But she did not know where the frame had gone. That was the first major emotional shift in the story. The object was not proof of some secret conspiracy. It was something more intimate. A forgotten piece of Diana's attempt to preserve normality. But why had Camilla reacted so strongly? Because the photograph associated with the frame had another connection. It was not simply Diana's photograph. It was a photograph of Diana with 2 boys, William and Harry. They were younger. The image captured an ordinary family moment. No ceremony, no public significance, just a mother and her children. But there was something written beneath it. Not a message to the public, a message to the boys. One day, when you are old enough, remember that this was enough. That sentence was not presented as an authentic quotation. It is part of the fictional narrative. But it expressed the emotional idea at the center of the story. Diana had wanted her sons to remember moments of family rather than only moments of history. Camilla looked at the photograph, and something unexpected happened. She cried. Not dramatically, not publicly. She simply looked away. For someone who had spent years being judged through the lens of Diana's story, the photograph represented something different. It reminded her of the human beings behind the headlines: Charles, Diana, the boys, and the complicated lives that followed. Camilla, in this fictional account, did not see the frame as an accusation. She saw it as a reminder. a reminder that some of the people involved had spent decades carrying histories they could never rewrite. That was why she asked Sophie not to hide it. She asked her to find the truth. That request changed everything. William and Catherine were brought into the discussion. William's reaction was restrained. He wanted to know where the photograph had come from. He wanted to know whether it was genuine. He wanted to know who had kept it. But most importantly, he wanted to know what Diana had intended. That question mattered, because William had spent much of his adult life protecting Diana's memory in his own way. He had spoken publicly about her. He had supported causes connected to her values. He had acknowledged the importance she continued to hold for him and his family. Yet the idea that she might have left behind a private message intended for a future moment would naturally carry emotional weight. Catherine, meanwhile, focused on Sophie. She asked whether Sophie was comfortable being involved. That mattered because the frame had unexpectedly turned Sophie into the custodian of something emotionally significant. Catherine understood that objects connected to Diana could easily become symbols. Once a story escaped into public attention, the object itself could become less important than the speculation surrounding it. So Catherine suggested something simple. Find out what it actually means before anyone decides what it means. Anne agreed. That became the family's unofficial principle. Evidence first, emotion second, speculation last. The investigation continued. The list of names was examined again. 5 names: William, Harry, Charles, Camilla, Sophie. Why those 5? Anne believed the answer might not be about ownership. Perhaps the list represented 5 people who would eventually understand the meaning of the object. Perhaps Sophie was last because she was supposed to receive it only after the others had lived long enough to understand what Diana had wanted. That theory sounded complicated, but then another document appeared, a photocopy of a handwritten note. Again, this is fictional material created for the story. The note contained only a few lines. The person who keeps it should not be the person who needs it most. It should be the person who can protect what it means. That changed the interpretation. The frame was never meant to belong permanently to one person. It was meant to be carried. A custodian, not an owner. And suddenly Sophie understood. She had been chosen not because she was the most important person connected to Diana. She had been chosen because she stood outside the original conflict. She could preserve the memory without being consumed by it. That was why the frame had come to her. But there was still one unanswered question. Why now? Why had the object resurfaced decades later? The answer came from the empty envelope. Sophie examined it again. This time, she noticed a small crease inside the lining. She carefully opened it. There was a second piece of paper. Only one sentence. When the family is ready to remember together. Sophie read it aloud. Anne looked at William. William looked at Catherine. Nobody spoke, because suddenly the entire mystery seemed to make sense. The heirloom was not intended to expose anyone. It was not intended to reveal a scandal. It was not intended to change the succession. It was not evidence of a hidden royal secret. It was a symbolic invitation. Remember together. That was the hidden revelation. According to the fictional story, Diana had understood that her children would eventually grow older. Their lives would change. Their relationships would change. The royal family itself would change. She could not know what the future would look like, but she could leave behind something small enough to survive the years, something that did not depend on public approval, something that could one day remind people that family history is not only about who was right. Sometimes it is about who remained, who forgave, who remembered, and who chose not to pass old pain to another generation. The revelation affected William deeply, because he realized the object was not really about Diana's relationship with Charles. It was not really about Camilla. It was about his childhood, about the years before everything became complicated, about the mother he remembered before the world turned her life into a permanent public story. Catherine understood that immediately. She did not ask William what he wanted to do with the frame. She simply remained beside him. Anne, characteristically, focused on the practical question. If the frame was meant to be passed on, who would receive it next? That was when Sophie made an unexpected suggestion. Perhaps nobody. Perhaps the frame should remain where it was. Not hidden, not displayed as a royal relic, just kept safely. And perhaps, one day, it could be shown to Diana's grandchildren. That idea gave the story its emotional center, because Diana's legacy was no longer only something belonging to the past. It could become something carried forward. Camilla heard the proposal. Her reaction was quiet. She looked at the photograph again. Then she said something that, within this dramatized narrative, surprised everyone. She believed Diana would have wanted the boys to have the memory, not the burden. That distinction mattered. Camilla had spent years living inside a history she could never completely separate herself from. But perhaps she had finally reached the point where she no longer needed to defend her place within that history. She could simply acknowledge it. And that was what made her emotional reaction so powerful. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. She did not ask Sophie to give her the frame. Because Sophie had become the custodian. Not of Diana's secrets, of Diana's intention. That was the difference. Charles eventually learned the full story. Within the fictional account, his reaction was even quieter than Camilla's. He looked at the photograph for a long time. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempt to rewrite the past, just a recognition that time had a strange way of reducing enormous events to small memories. A silver frame, a photograph, a handwritten sentence, and suddenly decades of history could be seen through something that fitted into a person's hands. William decided he wanted the photograph copied for his family, not because the original should be removed from Sophie, but because he wanted his children to know the ordinary side of their grandmother, the side that existed before the headlines, before the symbols, before the mythology. Catherine supported the idea. Anne made sure the original would be preserved properly. Sophie remained its custodian. And Camilla? She asked for one final look. She held the frame again. Then she turned it over. For the first time, she noticed something that nobody else had seen. There was a second inscription beneath the word remember. It had been almost completely worn away. Only 4 words remained. Love leaves no enemy. Sophie looked at her. Camilla did not explain what she thought it meant. Perhaps she did not know. Perhaps the phrase had been written by someone other than Diana. Perhaps it was never intended as a message about the people surrounding her life at all. That ambiguity was important, because not every mystery needs a perfect answer. Sometimes the meaning comes from the questions themselves. But Camilla's reaction suggested that the words had touched something deeply personal. For years, she had existed in the public imagination as one half of a complicated story, a story that often reduced several human beings to roles. The first wife, the second wife, the heir, the mother, the rival, the widow, the king. But people are rarely that simple. Diana had been more than a tragedy. Charles had been more than a husband in a failed marriage. Camilla had been more than the person audiences associated with its most painful chapter. William had been more than the grieving son. Harry had been more than the younger prince. And Sophie had been more than the person holding a silver frame. The heirloom forced them, in this fictional story, to confront something that royal history often makes difficult. Memory can be inherited, but so can resentment. The difference is what people choose to do with it. That was why the object mattered. Not because it was valuable, not because it contained a secret capable of destroying anyone, but because it represented a choice. Keep the past as a weapon, or keep it as a lesson. The family chose the second. At least, that is how the dramatized story ends. The frame was not placed on public display. It did not become a palace exhibit. There was no dramatic announcement, no official statement, no ceremony. Instead, Sophie kept it, safely, quietly, exactly as the original intention supposedly required. The photograph was carefully preserved. Copies were made for the family, and the written clues were kept together. The mystery was finally understood as something smaller and more human than anyone had initially imagined. Diana had not left behind a weapon. She had left behind a memory. And perhaps that is why the story of the silver frame matters. Because when people talk about royal heirlooms, they usually imagine diamonds, crowns, jewels, objects worth fortunes. But the objects that survive longest in families are often the ones nobody would think to steal. A photograph, a handwritten note, a small frame, a child's drawing, something that mattered because someone loved it. The fictional Sophie did not become the owner of Diana's legacy. She became its caretaker. And Camilla did not lose something. She gained the chance to see a painful chapter from another angle. William did not discover a secret that changed his mother's history. He discovered a reminder of the mother he had known before history turned her into an icon. Catherine saw something else. She saw how easily the next generation could inherit stories they never lived. And Anne, perhaps more than anyone, understood the responsibility of preserving something without exaggerating it. That may have been the most royal lesson of all. Not everything meaningful needs to become public. Not every family memory needs an audience. Some things are important precisely because they remain intimate. And somewhere within the fictional story, the silver frame remains with Sophie. Waiting. Not for another scandal. Not for another revelation. But for another generation. For the day when Diana's grandchildren might hold it and ask the simplest question of all. Who was she? And perhaps the answer would not begin with princess. It would begin with mother. Because that was the meaning hidden inside the little silver frame. Not a secret that could destroy the royal family. A memory that could humanize it. And perhaps that explains Camilla's reaction more than anything else. She did not see a rival's relic. She saw a piece of a past that had shaped everyone's lives. She saw Diana. She saw Charles. She saw William and Harry as children. She saw the years that could never be repeated. And she understood something that time eventually teaches almost everyone. You cannot change what happened, but you can choose what you carry forward. The story began with Sophie receiving a box she did not understand. It ended with her understanding that the box had never really been hers. It belonged to memory. And memory, unlike jewelry or titles, does not have a single owner. It moves from one generation to another. It waits in drawers. It survives in photographs. It appears unexpectedly decades later. And sometimes, when a family is finally ready, it finds its way home. That is the final mystery of Diana's hidden heirloom. Perhaps the most important thing was never what the frame contained. Perhaps it was what the frame asked people to do. Remember, not perfectly, not selectively, not with bitterness. Just remember. Because a family does not heal by pretending its history never happened. It heals when the people who inherit that history decide not to inherit all of its pain. And in this fictional story, that was the choice Sophie placed before the royal family. Not Diana versus Camilla. Not the past versus the present. Not one person against another. But memory without resentment. Love without ownership. And family without the need to rewrite history. The silver frame remained small, almost ordinary, almost forgettable. But perhaps that was exactly what made it worthy of being remembered. If you enjoyed this fictional royal mystery, subscribe for more dramatized stories inspired by the history, personalities, and public lives surrounding the British royal family. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not hidden inside palaces. Sometimes they are hidden inside the smallest things. A photograph, a handwritten message, a forgotten heirloom, and a memory that, after all those years, finally finds its way home.